Okay. I'd like to welcome everybody to today's presentation of the PHJV webinar series. Our speaker today will be Graeme Patterson. He'll be speaking to us about the JV8 Central Grasslands Conservation Initiative. Graeme, if you would like to, please feel free to take over.
All right, firstly, let me just double check. Can you all see my presentation and hear my voice?
Yes.
Great. All right, well, thanks, Ian, and I should say thanks to John Patterson Williams for inviting me here. John can't be on the seminar today, but he's already apologized to me for that, and he normally gives a little bit of a bio of the presenter, so I'll try and quickly go through that myself without boring you too much. John and I actually both worked, we're both British, and we both worked at the Natural Resources Institute at the University of Greenwich, London. My role there and my role post my PhD was as an aquatic ecologist with a speciality in the African Great Lakes. I moved from a series of positions based in Africa and working with academia too into a position. I moved to the US in 2001 to work with the Bronx Zoo, or the Wildlife Conservation Society, as many of you may know it better, as the Africa Program Director. And through the period of 15 years that I was based out of the Bronx, WCS had a growing Africa program focused on conservation of important landscapes. I had moved really from being a scientist to being a program planner and administrator, and that was my transition as I moved out from Africa into working with a large institution, and that remains. I moved to Colorado 5 years ago, and with working in a similar role that I had done in the Bronx with the Denver Zoo, and then after that took up the position of JV8 Conservation Director just over a year ago, and that's what I'll obviously be talking about. Two things to apologize for in a way. Some of this may be familiar to some of you. But I'm going to go back and talk a little bit about joint ventures, what they are, why there is a thing called JV8, and then get into what it intends to do. The other thing that I apologize for is I tend to do these talks rather unscripted. So, I'm guided by my slides, and hopefully I'll cover everything, but I will, or certainly intend to leave good amount of time for questions, because being with that style, I think it leaves some open ends to sort of fill in the details later. So the JV8 Central Grasslands Conservation Initiative, and that map that you see on your screen now is one of the versions defining the grasslands biome across the US, Canada, and Mexico. I will point out too that the slides around show some of the key species that are grassland dependent, but also sort of tries to highlight the fact that these are working lands, and the majority of the remaining undisturbed grasslands in North America are not public lands, but largely private lands and indigenous lands dedicated to ranching. So let's see. But let's go back a little bit, and joint ventures, this, because I'm talking to an organized talk by the Prairie Habitat joint venture, but joint ventures were established in the 80s as partnership organizations, and largely to implement the North American Wetlands Management Plan. And so the core of the joint ventures occupied some of the central regions, and this includes prairie habitat, that were really the kind of wetland duck production part of the North American continent. And the primary funding support for the joint ventures in those initial stages was through the North American North American Wetlands Conservation Act, NORCA. And the kind of innovative part of that act was that it was biome based. And so funding for that act supported work in Canada, Mexico, as well as the US, based on the biology of the waterfowl and wetlands that it was intended to support. Joint ventures were established as partnership organizations. They're managed, at least in the US, through the US Fish and Wildlife Service. But the boards, the individual joint ventures are really board-led organizations, and on those boards there are multiple partners represented, and not just on the boards but in the actual delivery on the ground. And with the understanding of the initial focus on wetlands, joint ventures over that time have delivered a great deal of habitat conservation and restoration over that time. Through the 90s and into the early 2000s, though, the focus on wetlands was expanded to a sort of all birds mandate, and that therefore involved a huge expansion of the joint ventures across the continental US. And these are the boundaries that you can see on this map. They are a combination of political boundaries and biogeographic boundaries. And as I look at this map, what jumps out at me, of course, is the grassland piece of that. And this is Prairie Habitat Joint Venture, which is the northern extension of the bird conservation region that I've forgotten its name now, but that extends into the US too. The only missing joint venture here in the California coast now since this map was given to me, is now in existence. So it really is comprehensive coverage of North America, down extending into sort of the central part of Mexico. What joint ventures do is they provide communications and science capacity, they build field capacity, and I think essentially are on the ground delivery agents. They have staff based on, focused on actual conservation actions on the ground, and that might be, managing burns. They might be working with ranchers to develop easements on their land. It involves shrub clearance and other things. I'll talk a little bit about all of these things later. And as in the name, they are partnership organizations and have a mandate to reach out and work with all the other agencies that are in the same field as them. And they have a history and a success in leveraging matching funding. They get federal dollars to support their core activities, but go out and seek grants and other funding. And I think the number quoted to me is that they've already, the history is leveraging federal funds at a 10-to-1 ratio. So, bringing in $10 for every $1 of federal support money, and that sort of expands their role through that. You'll see here are the 8 joint ventures that combined to create the JV8, and they really are the 8. You see now that there's strong biogeographic element to the joint venture boundaries, and that the 8 that occupied the main piece of the grasslands biome is that green outline that you see there. I included on this slide that the sort of each joint venture is run by a coordinator, And I always think the thing that strikes me about this and struck me very early on is that some of the staff are federal staff. So Sean Fields is a Fish and Wildlife Service federal employee, and others work for a combination. Playa Lakes is its own NGO, and others, like the Northern Great Plains, is Catherine Whiteman is from Ducks Unlimited. Karen Chapman and others are ABC Birds. So it's really hard to pin down what joint ventures are when you think that each has its own individual characteristics in terms of staffing and funding. But these are the 8, and about 3 or 4 years ago, these 8 joint ventures that somewhat acted independently recognized that in order to address issues around grassland conservation, they should combine their efforts and see how they can build a synergy across those programs. And that's really the JV8 rationale, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. One of the things is just a slide that, the jump out joint venture that doesn't really have a great footprint in the grasslands biome is the Sonoran joint venture. But this addresses the issue that for many of the important bird species that are the principal joint venture targets, they winter outside of what are the key grasslands. They are less dependent on grasslands in their wintering range and even their migratory routes than they are for breeding. And this is just a good example. The lark bunting, which happens to be the Colorado state bird where I live, shows this important dependence on grassland for its breeding range, but in its wintering range is less filial to grasslands, and therefore, if we're doing all bird conservation for migratory species, we really want to tackle some of the sort of wintering range and wintering habitat requirements as well as breeding. Others of the birds migrate much further south, and so we're mindful of that, but don't aren't expanding our role into South America just yet. But who knows? The issue around one of the sort of imperatives around grassland birds is the substantial loss over the last 50 years, and this was highlighted in Rosenberg's paper, the 3 Billion Bird Report, that amongst all the different bird guilds or breeding guilds, grassland birds have fared the worst over this last 50 years. And that's called that out with the green arrow at the top. I've also put an arrow here to show the kind of the group, the bird group that kicks the general trend is wetland birds. And though I think JVs should not take full credit for the success of wetland conservation and wetland bird conservation over the last 50 years, it is an indicator that conservation can work. And I think it is an encouraging number that should give us some encouragement to go and work on other species guilds as well. The background and the principal cause of the major decline is the loss of grasslands. And there are a number of causes of that, which I'll mention in a minute, but I think this is an interesting map. This is the historic range of grasslands, and you can see that in this paper they divided them out into the various grassland types related to vegetation and other habitat characteristics. But if I've got this on a slow fade, and if we move forward in time, and this was the sort of pre-colonial grassland extent as best as we understand it, and you see actually very striking that long grass prairie extended right to the Great Lakes historically. If we look now and go forward to the present, you see that there has been a major decline And particularly in this sort of central band with the long grass prairies, which was, those grasses were maintained through fire and grazing, essentially bison and a combination of deliberately set fires as well as, lightning created strike fires, etc. But this is relatively high rainfall and was the great arable expansion from the east that ate into grassland habitat. And so you see that we really are dealing with, arguably there's very little that we can recover the long grass prairies into that land. It is more than 95% converted to arable land. And maybe pockets still exist and maybe there are conservation actions, but the large bulk now and the principal target is these grasslands that abut the Rocky Mountains and extend to sort of a limited distance east. And I think when we looked at the old map, maybe I'll go up briefly. You can see that largely the eastern extent of the grasslands has gone. And the two principal ecological kind of factors that are maintaining grasslands are grazing and fire. And what has happened over time is that the bison that traditionally or historically grazed this land have been replaced by cattle, and the principal economic activity in the remaining undisturbed grasslands is ranching. Now, the good news for birds is that they don't care who eats their grass, and that cattle are, some recent reports are just as equally effective at maintaining biological diversity on grasslands than bison. And although bison is recovery of bison is happening, it's a modest effort compared to the extent of the cattle grazing across this land. So JV8. JV8 was, as I said before, initiated to consolidate the work of the 8 joint ventures that covered the grassland biome and focus on how they can collectively elevate their work in grassland conservation with a target to reverse declines of those grassland guild of birds. It started prior to my engagement, and you'll see there where I was hired, with a grassland assessment, which looked at current rates of decline by joint venture. And the shocking truth of that was that we were still losing almost 2% of our grasslands each year. I converted my acres to hectares for my Canadian audience. Of the 250 million hectares of grassland that falls within that biome, almost 2% are lost each year, and principally lost to two things. One is conversion of grasslands to arable lands or irrigated lands, and therefore once the grassland is plowed, then recovery is either not going to happen or is a very long process. The other is that suppression of fire, and this is particularly an issue in the southern part of the grassland biome. Suppression of fire has meant that shrubs are encroaching on grasslands, and that is both a problem for the principal ranching economy as well as for birds. The grassland-dependent birds will not even tolerate a relatively low density of shrubs, and so that's a big threat. And the shrub encroachment across the entire biome is almost equal to the amount of arable land conversion that's happening as well. So two big issues or big threats to grassland and grassland species. So the phase 2 of the grassland assessment report, these are all available on our kind of nascent website, but which I'll give you the link to later. The phase that began with hiring my position, it was in October 2020. I came on board, and my role and responsibility is really to consolidate this work and think how I can elevate this work as well. In other words, developing a greater kind of culture around grassland conservation, and maybe, and hopefully, directing more resources to the work on the ground that the joint ventures individually have been doing for some time. My first task really was to complete a strategy, which was a painful and long process because of all the different stakeholders in that process. But we have the strategy now and have had it for a few months, since June last year, actually more than a few months. And that's also on our website and really an underpinning of the approach that the joint ventures, or the 8 joint ventures, are going to take under the banner of JV8. We then are, and this is the current ongoing thing, is developing a certain number of products that will help us to meet that need for more and greater. And I'll talk a little bit, because those are elements of the strategy, which I'll talk about in a second. Just want to check time. The phase 3, of course, is the ongoing piece. Joint ventures, I wouldn't say consistently across the 8, but all have addressed and pivoted to some extent towards grassland conservation, from their wetland beginnings. And they are already implementing a number of conservation actions. I won't go into this, but there are a lot of programs, some of them operating at an individual joint venture, and others are, and the sort of thing that I hope to generate even more of our cross joint venture activities that have a grassland focused. Of course, we're constrained by lots of things, including funding, to do more and do better, and that's kind of that's the JV8 challenge right there. As part of the strategy, the mission and vision, I will leave these up on the screen for a little bit, but the key things to kind of notice from this, and I've highlighted those, it is a tri-national project, and so there's a lot of issues around the different sort of legislative and political pieces of that. There is this opportunity through international collaboration that exists. There is also the international piece of this. So the UN are interested in grasslands. Temperate grasslands are globally threatened. The CEC, who I always forget what that stands for, but it's an international cooperation, North American cooperation institution that's already focused on grasslands as a key transboundary issue. The other thing I've highlighted in the vision mission is the people part. So, we're working quite a lot with the sagebrush group that works further west from here, where largely their issue is public land. They work largely on public land. It's the big issue, or the big sort of land management piece of that sagebrush country. But in our land, it's private land and tribal land. And so, the whole economy of land use and the importance of the people on that land is critical. And the other part of the people thing is the maintenance of grazing animals on the land to maintain the habitat. So, if land passed from private to public, then you'd still have to put a grazer on it. You might switch from cattle to bison, but if you lifted that pressure on the vegetation, then most of the grasslands would convert to shrublands. And I just highlighted on the mission the partnerships piece. So JVs are partner organizations. I think the opportunity for growth is not focusing inward on joint venture growth, but thinking about how we can expand the partnerships that we already have. One of the things I'm going to call out right now is that we're not the only initiative, of course, working on grasslands, as you all surely know. And one of the sort of initiatives that we're working closely with is the Central Grasslands Roadmap. And this is coordinated by the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, and it is developing a strategy around grasslands, sort of not in parallel with us, but complementary to what we do. And we participate in much of the committee work that's going on with the Central Grasslands Roadmap. They are building towards a summit in May, which they hope to hold in Fort Collins in person. We'll see. Their last summit in 2020 was, of course, virtual, and this is really meant to launch their plan and see about how together we can start to bring in more resources to the conservation of grasslands. There are many opportunities that, you know, I'm slightly more aware of what's going on in the US with new legislation, you know, a drafted Grassland Conservation Act, which is sort of a parallel to the Wetlands Act. There are also other things, America the Beautiful, 30 by 30, a number of initiatives out of the current administration that is emphasizing a focus on grasslands. And that's an opportunity that we need to be poised to take up. I think, you know, JV8 maybe played a small part, but a number of organizations have shifted attention to grasslands as one of the great conservation challenges. And that, you know, instead of being flyover country, as the central grassland region is called by some, it becomes an important piece. It has both cultural and important biological elements, and as you can see, as we've showed, is deeply threatened. So the JV8 strategy that is there on that jv8.org website, which needs work, but has the key things already there, is really, these are the 5 key elements of the strategy, and none of them are going to be particularly surprising. The first one, of course, is accelerate conservation actions. The gap between what we can do and what we can is, you know, against the 2 million or 2% annual loss of grasslands is significant and big. So we're trying to sort of think how we can bridge that gap with this long-term view of stabilizing grassland bird populations over the next sort of 20 years with, you know, and that's just reducing loss. Realistically, to think about restoring and recovering populations has to be and will inevitably be a much longer goal. Marketing and fundraising is part of that piece of acceleration. And we think marketing might sound sort of trite, but it's you know, it's raising awareness about the plight of grasslands in order to draw in partnerships, whether they be funders, or other engaged partners, is all part of the plan around that. And we are developing a marketing strategy for JV8 as we speak. Policy changes, I referenced policy earlier, that there are a number of initiatives that could direct more resources to grasslands. And part of that is, you know, some of the policies that exist are having a negative impact on grasslands, such as subsidies for corn-related gasoline and supplements, et cetera, et cetera. And I know, you know, some of the development projects, you know, in terms of agricultural expansion and conversion, are counter to what we would hope to achieve in grassland conservation. Promote applied research. There are a lot of research efforts that focus on big picture grassland conservation. Joint ventures are very focused on actual conservation delivery on the ground. You know, and I mentioned earlier, shrub clearance, burning, you know, restoration of fringing grasslands around wetlands and all of these things. And that's really where we need research support, is effectiveness of conservation actions, best return on investment for conservation actions, how sustainable conservation actions are in the long term. If you clear your shrubs, do they come back in 5 years and you've really not affected much positive change? And all of those things are still open questions as to how best to approach grassland conservation. And then innovation and new initiatives. And I particularly think about the value of ecosystem services provided by grasslands. They are great storers of carbon, mostly underground and not like forests overground, which renders them somewhat more resilient to the issues around fire, and once lost, very difficult to recover. There are other sort of important ecosystem services provided by grasslands: soil conservation, water, maintaining hydrological services, etc. None of these, though, are really benefiting and contributing towards conservation of grasslands. And I think in that new initiatives place, the issue around payment for ecosystem services is going to be key. That those that are responsible for conserving grasslands, and I'm largely talking about indigenous and ranching communities, should get the benefits and have the contribution from the greater economy and the greater public benefit that supports their work. The other area that we're trying to innovate already is thinking more about social science as opposed to hard biological science. That much of the issues around grassland conservation and conversion is a social issue. It's about perceptions. It's about behaviors of agriculturalists. It's in that space that, and when I'm talking about social science, I'm probably talking about social economic science. It's really what's driving it on what is largely private lands. And a number of new positions are being created in the social sciences to try and support this work, and thinking about the crossover between social and biological science and how we can drive more success through this effort. And so thinking a little bit about implementation of JV8, thinking about those things that we intended to do, and I'm going to talk about one of them in particular in a second. That we're developing a website, which is part of the outreach effort. There's the website that exists with some of the key documents on that already, and you can have a look at that. And it's got my contacts on, and so anything that doesn't covered by questions or others, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll put my contacts up at the end. We're working through a set of committees within the joint ventures. And when I say within the joint ventures, that includes the partnerships that we have. So mainly through the boards, but we're sort of tapping into the expertise that exists in the greater joint venture to get to some of the key issues that were highlighted in the strategy. One of the first ones there, metrics, is kind of the challenge that JV8 first sort of acknowledged when it was created, was that each joint venture was working in a sort of, bubble seems too cruel to them, but within a kind of area where they each use different metrics to measure success. And we need to harmonize those, and we have a committee working to do just that, to set real targets and really hold ourselves to those targets and monitor those targets as well. The outreach and communications piece that we think is vital to bring in additional support. We've just recently issued an RFP to go to communication specialists to think about how we best do that, and if you want to apply for that, you've got till Friday. So apologies for that late notice, but it's there, and it really is, we think, an important role that JV8 plays that highlights and brings greater attention to this. And I think we've had some success already in this space, but I think we can do more. The policy support, we're kind of federally funded, so we don't advocate for policy, but we inform policy. Not least because joint ventures have had the kind of history of working on the Wetlands Act for many, many years and seeing what pieces of it were successful and what pieces were not. And then we have a fundraising committee, and I kind of get it that my position as coordinator of the joint venture 8 is ultimately going to be measured in respect to what new resources I can, catalyze bringing into the on the ground efforts for conservation. The other, apart from committees, we're having some sort of internal workshops to, I won't go into this really, but really thinking about pieces of the strategy and how we can enact them, in a practical way. The last one on this list that I'll just highlight in red is something we've called CGAM, which there hasn't been an acronym that's caught on yet, but it's the Central Grasslands Avian Modeling Project, and it relates to the metrics piece. That assuming, and I think it's reasonable to assume that the greatest threat to grassland birds is habitat loss, is thinking about habitat quality and populations. And it is something that the Prairie Habitat joint venture pioneered, and probably too many words on this slide, but the reason CGAMP hasn't caught on as an acronym is because everybody calls it Barry Robinson's project. So Barry, with ECCC, has developed a model for Prairie Habitat joint venture that links population with habitat in a way that hasn't really been done across the whole of the biome, and therefore is a key piece to setting bird conservation targets and focusing conservation efforts on the highest value places across that sort of extremely large piece of land. So we've initiated this CGAM project. We're in the early stages, although we estimate that it'll be completed within 6 months, that will develop a biome-wide model that looks at breeding habitat and bird populations. And I kind of call out breeding habitat because if you look at the last point, that I think the early map showed that, there's since most of the grassland dependent gilt are migratory species, and certainly almost all, I think all of the Canadian, the northern part of the grasslands are migratory species. We have to think about whole bird biology and the demographics of birds across their both breeding and wintering range. And there has been a focus on breeding range and habitat needs, and that's probably largely because that's the key threat, is loss of breeding habitat. But there are other pieces to this, and so expanding this model that is established within the prairie habitat across the whole biome is the object of CGAMP. And hats off to Barry and Canada and all the ECCC that not only are they prepared to commit time to working across the biome, they're also committing some resources to support the kind of major data entry piece of this work. It relies a lot on the IMBCR bird data that Bird Conservancy of the Rockies has really led on developing, and the habitat maps are to some extent are based on remote sensing imagery, but WWF have done a lot of work on looking at grassland quality and grassland loss across the entire biome with their Plowprint project. So that's one of the activities going forward, and hopefully a number of more. And that's really where I finish up. Just put the map back up, and those are my contacts. That's the website. I even put my personal phone number on there because I'm really happy to be contacted and answer any questions and really explore. There's a lot of pieces to this, and really explore the partnership element and how we might get further in implementing that elements of that strategy. stay, and just sort of the parting shot is there's a big imperative there. It's a major global conservation issue, and that the challenges are real and large. But I think the time, we have hit a sweet spot in terms of the time and attention being paid, and I think conservation needs to take advantage of that. All right, Ian, thank you. I'll finish there, and hopefully I've left enough time for a few questions.
Great. Thank you, Graeme, for your interesting presentation. If you do have questions, feel free to type them in the chat box or raise your hand, and we'll address them in order. First question is the intent to maintain the status quo, wind back the clock, or imagine a new future for future landscape with preferred species? In which case, who picks the winners and losers?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. It's a big question, right? Conservation tends to be opportunistic, and there tends to be an element of triage in it. I think that the most important thing in the sort of short term or medium term is to prevent further loss of grassland habitat as best we can, and that is going to be working with private landowners or land stewards, and really trying to sort of arrest the decline before we push back. There are opportunities for restoration that exist. One thing I didn't even touch on was the fact that the aquifer that feeds much of the arable crops in the eastern part of our range is drying up. It's both a climate change issue as well as the fact that it's being exhausted through heavy irrigation. So there are opportunities there for restoring land from arable back to grazing land, which is less water dependent. And there are some good signs that, I mean, it's not necessarily good for local economies, but the good signs for the grassland that there's some recovery there. But it's largely triage as well at the moment, and I think that's why the ambition of is like arresting declines is really the best we can hope for in the medium term. I don't see any more in the chats there.
No. Good. Okay. Well, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everybody for attending today's presentation. If you do have questions or you come up with questions, please feel free to contact Graeme or John Patterson Williams, and he'll get you in touch with Graeme to answer any questions you may have going forward. Graeme, thank you for your presentation today. I'd like to take this opportunity to wish everybody a happy and healthy 2022. And we look forward to having you attend the February edition of the PHJV webinar series. Thank you for attending, everyone, and have a great day.
No, my pleasure. Thanks for being on board.